you searching for answers? Discover your true identity. Stay tuned to Shalom World.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Heart Talk. Today we're in the city of Perth, one of the most isolated cities in Australia, where we have more than 105 parishes, 113 schools and colleges spread over more than 420,000 square kilometres. We're speaking with Perth Archbishop Timothy Costelloe, who was announced as the 9th Archbishop of Perth in March 2012. Come with us and speak with Archbishop Costelloe. We're delighted that Archbishop Costelloe can join us here today, and we hope that he will enjoy this conversation. Archbishop Costelloe, thank you for being here today. And how have you been in this time?
Thanks, Jamie, and it's good to be here with you. I've been looking forward to this.
So you've been Archbishop now for nearly 9 years. What has that journey been like for you, that experience, the people, the parishes, the schools?
So far it's been a very rewarding journey, but also a very challenging journey. The role of a bishop is not an easy one these days, but it's one full of joy and energy because you meet so many good people, you involve yourself in so many of the things that the church is doing for us here in our Archdiocese of Perth. So yes, I've enjoyed it. I've found it challenging at times, but I've received a great deal of support from the clergy, the religious, the people of the diocese. So far so good, Jamie.
I remember meeting you in the late 1990s when you were parish priest of Victoria Park and you were teaching at Notre Dame. What were your first impressions of the Archdiocese from that time to now?
Well, when I became the Archbishop, I had, as you say, already been working here for 4 years from 1996 to 1999 as a parish priest. I hadn't been to Perth before that, and so my initial impressions were of a very beautiful city, a very lively city, but relatively quiet compared to the big cities of Sydney and Melbourne. That's changed quite a bit since then. We're a much bigger city, a more vibrant city. It's still a very beautiful city. It's a wonderful place to live. And the church in Perth is a very vibrant church. So in some ways, things have changed, but in other ways, not so much.
So you joined the Salesian Order in around 1977. How did that and how has that shaped your formation, your life as a priest, as an archbishop, and continuing today?
So I joined the Salesians in 77, and interestingly, I think I'd never really considered the possibility of going to a diocesan seminary. Somehow or other I knew that I needed to be and wanted to be a Salesian and part of a religious life. The idea of a community around me, a community of prayer, a community of activity, and a community of spirit, it was important to me then, and even though I'm now a bishop, it still remains important to me.
So you must have had some pretty influential people in your life. Can you tell us who some of those people were and what difference they made in your life as a priest and even as a Catholic, as a lay Catholic before you were ordained?
Well, I mean, I come from what I would describe as a good Catholic family. Mum and Dad were committed to the faith. I have one older brother. And Mum and Dad made many sacrifices to send my brother and me to Catholic schools, both primary and secondary. So for most people who continue with their faith, whether as priests, for some of the Salesians, in fact most of the Salesians that I met and had to do with as a boy at school, left a big impression on me for the reasons that I mentioned just before. But even amongst them, there are a few I think that stand out. As a boy at school there was one, and he was the one who in many ways helped me to discern my vocation. So I remember him with great fondness. But later on, as a young Salesian in formation, probably the most significant figure was Father Frank Maloney. Father Maloney is a renowned biblical scholar all around the world, and I was very fortunate to have him as my rector all through my years of formation, biblical studies, as my spiritual director, and as a very good friend. And he still remains a good friend today. So a number of Salesians, Father Maloney amongst them probably, were very significant for me. I've had many wonderful friends, both other religious priests, but many lay people, some very close friends who have accompanied me on my journey and from whom I've drawn great encouragement and inspiration. So like all of us, I suppose, we can look back to very significant figures. I could go on forever about them because there are so many, but there's just a couple that give you a sense.
And so you were announced then as Archbishop of Perth in 2012, having been an auxiliary bishop in Melbourne. At your installation mass, the heart of your message was to call the church to Christ and Christ to the church.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about that message, what that means for you, and also what you want that to mean?
It struck me as a very powerful statement about religious life. And then when I became the Archbishop here, it struck me as an extremely powerful concept, idea about how we as a church might move forward and become the church we're meant to be. It's not as if we don't belong to the church or the church doesn't belong to Christ, but we don't always live that way. We don't always even think that way. And so that became, if you like, the hallmark, certainly of that installation ceremony and of everything that I've been trying to do as the Archbishop in Perth ever since. I think for Father Chavez, it possibly goes back to that wonderful document of John Paul II, Novo Millennio in Eunte, where he says to the whole church on the verge of the third millennium that all of our witness, all of our activity, all of our life as a church, all of our mission, if you like, will be hopelessly inadequate unless we've first contemplated the face of Christ. So my deep desire in the Archdiocese is to help all of us together to put Christ at the centre, not just in theory, but in practice. That the church is his body. The church is led by his Spirit, and it's our fidelity to him that determines whether or not and to what extent we're the church that we're supposed to be, that God created us to be.
That's fantastic. And that continues on in your pastoral plan that was launched in 2016,
Yes.
where you invited the Church of Perth to walk in the footsteps of the Good Shepherd. How has that been working for you? How has that message been implemented throughout the Archdiocese?
I think it's gradually growing in the consciousness of all of us here in the Archdiocese of Perth. Again, it's very similar to what I just said. We need to be sure that we are walking in the footsteps of Jesus. And one of the best images, I think, of Jesus, and one that he used of himself, is of himself as the Good Shepherd. We're his disciples. And so if we're going to do anything, we should be walking in his footsteps. When I became the Archbishop, I chose the motto, Via Veritas Vita, the way, the truth, and the life. The words of Jesus, of course. And as I often say to people, if you don't know which way to go or you're feeling lost, follow the way of Jesus. If you don't know what to commit yourself to the truth of Jesus. If you're unsure how to be living your life, live your life according to the inspiration and model of Jesus. So as the Good Shepherd, and it's the image that I have on my cross here, which is the same cross that Pope Francis wears, it's the image of the Good Shepherd. It also happens to be the image that is at the very heart of the cross that Salesians wear, because Don Bosco was very keen on us as Salesians to relate with other people, particularly the young, as a good shepherd. So it's a pretty central part of my own spirituality, but also of my own understanding of what is at the heart of the church itself.
Can you tell us about your love for Catholic education and what that means in today's world, why families bring their children to Catholic education today?
Here in Australia, we're very fortunate because we have a very extensive Catholic education system right across the country, and it's one that receives a great deal of government support, particularly financially. So that enables us to have a very comprehensive education system. As I often say to people, where else and how else could the church come into contact 5 days a week, 40 weeks of the year, from 9 o'clock in the morning till 3:30 in the afternoon, and enable young children, from the very small ones right up to the young adults, to be immersed in a Catholic environment. So I think our involvement in education is absolutely central to our work here in Australia as the church. I'm very proud of it. I'm very supportive of it, in awe of the commitment of our teachers, both at the leadership level, our principals and deputy principals, but the staff generally. We have a wonderful system, not perfect, always there is room for improvement, but a very wonderful system.
Your Grace, this year we have the Australian Catholic Youth Festival in Perth. Tell us what that is going to mean for the Archdiocese.
Jamie, this is one of the most exciting things that I have been involved in since I became the Archbishop. Everybody knows, or most people know, of the wonderful success of World Youth Days. But not everybody is able to afford to go to those kinds of wonderful events. And so some years ago, the Australian bishops made the decision that in the intervening period between two World Youth Days, we would have a local event, which we're calling the Australian Catholic Youth Festival. The first one was in Melbourne, the next one was in Adelaide, the next one was in Sydney, and now we've been able to have it here in Perth. This year is about listening to the voice of the Spirit, because that's the theme of the Plenary Council, which is another thing that we might talk about shortly that is happening here in Australia. But for me anyway, as the Archbishop, I'm seeing this opportunity for our Archdiocese to host the Australian Catholic Youth Festival really is an opportunity to relaunch our youth ministry here in the diocese. We have a very active youth ministry. We're very blessed with fine young leaders who do a wonderful job. But I think always there's a good opportunity to, as I say, relaunch something, to give it a new sense of vigour and enthusiasm. So it's very exciting. Over 30 of the bishops will be joining us. That's most of the bishops in Australia. We're having wonderful support from right across the diocese and right across the state of Western Australia from the various dimensions of the church's life.
Can you tell me a bit more about the faith formation side of it and how the festival will serve to form young people today,
Yes.
particularly with all the different challenges with social media, with the family issues that they may experience, the social issues they may experience? What's important there?
I made the link a moment ago between World Youth Day and the Australian Catholic Youth Festival. And so the kinds of things that happen at World Youth Day will also be a part of the festival, but on a smaller scale, of course. World Youth Day goes for a week or more. This is only 3 days. But it will include big gatherings in the exhibition centre, the convention centre, not far from where we're meeting. And that's big enough to hold 5,000 people or more in one venue. So there'll be big gatherings of young people. There'll be lots of energy, lots of music, faith music, but the kind of music that young people really relate to. There'll be drama, there'll be art, there'll be all those kinds of things. And there'll be keynote addresses given during those big meetings. But there'll also be many, many opportunities for workshops and small group meetings. Some, for example, with the bishops. All the bishops will be very happy to make themselves available to almost do a question and answer session with young people. They're always lively sessions and sometimes quite challenging, but the bishops are very committed to that. There'll be opportunities for reconciliation, always a big feature of the Australian Catholic Youth Festival. There'll be Eucharistic worship. We'll finish with a closing Mass, which is really an event for the whole Archdiocese. So I've invited everybody in the Archdiocese to come to this open-air Mass. So look, it's an experience of the young church, if I could put it that way. I've never been very keen on the idea of talking about young people as the future of the church in Australia. The young people are the present of the church in Australia as much as any other member of the church. So for them to come together, it will be a great support for them, because often in their faith they can feel a bit isolated, but to see thousands of other young Catholics who are also interested in their faith is a great sense of encouragement. But it will also be a wonderful witness to our older Catholics, my generation for example, that the church isn't dying, that the church is alive, that young people really are looking to the church to provide them with a way of understanding their life, what God's asking of them. So look, as you can see, I'm very excited about it. I think it's a wonderful opportunity, and very grateful that as a Salesian, I'm able to be promoting this here in Perth.
And you were talking just shortly before about the plenary council,
Yes.
Which is going to be held in 2020, and we've been preparing for that over the past year or so. Can you tell me about your role in that to start with?
Yes. In order for us to have a plenary council is a very solemn gathering of a local church. So in order for us to have one, we actually needed approval from the Pope. And before the Pope could give approval, the bishops had to choose who would be the president of the plenary council, and that name would be submitted to the Pope and he would either approve or not. So they chose me, and the Pope has approved that nomination. So I am now the president of the plenary council, which doesn't mean that I run everything, but I kind of preside over everything, and I'm responsible for making sure that it goes well and that it follows all of the church's requirements in these matters, and that any decisions that we might take are properly submitted to Rome for approval. So that's one role that I have. But we have a small group of bishops, which we're calling the Bishops' Commission for the Plenary Council, which is overseeing what is proven to be a very lengthy process of preparation. And I've also been elected as the chair of that commission. So I have an ongoing role in the development of the Plenary Council. We haven't had one in Australia since 1937. They're rather rare events. And so this is something quite new for most of us. We're doing it slightly differently. We've had a 2 or 3 year lead in. And in one sense, the Plenary Council has already begun. We wanted to listen carefully to what Pope Francis has been saying to the Church about the importance of synodality. And as Pope Francis often says, synodality is about everybody in the Church listening to each other. That's what we've tried to do in the preparation stage. We had a long period of what we called listening and discussion. And it was a remarkable, we had well over 200,000 people engaged across Australia in this. Listening and dialogue is the actual name of it. That produced, as you would imagine, an enormous range of ideas about what might be good for the church moving into the future. And we're now in the process, we've sifted through all of those, we've grouped all of those ideas, and we've now come up with half a dozen key themes for the Plenary Council. But it's really important to remember or to note that the central question of the Plenary Council is, what do you think God is asking of us in Australia at this time? That's not the way the question started out. When we started formulating the question, it was, what would you like to see happen in the church in the future? Something like that. But we gradually came to understand that the real question is, what does God want to see for the church in the future? That's an invitation to a very deep discernment. And that's a process that perhaps we're not as skilled in or as used to here in Australia as we should be as a church. And so the long period of preparation has really been an attempt to invite the whole church into a period of listening to each other, sharing each other's stories. In the process of doing that, trying to catch what God might be saying of us, and then thinking our way into that. So we came up with 6 themes. We now have groups formally constituted who are preparing draft documents on those 6 themes at the same time across Australia, in parishes, in school communities, in other communities connected with the church's ministry. People are also being invited to reflect on those 6 themes. Hopefully this will lead to the agenda for the Plenary Council. which will hold its first formal session in October next year. And then following the pattern Pope Francis set with the Synod on the Family, rather than just have one session, we're having two. So one in October 2020, depending on what comes as the fruit of that meeting, that will determine what the second session looks like, which will probably be in June of 2021. So it's an exercise really in discernment, of trying to catch the voice of the Holy Spirit in the midst of a very confused world in some ways, and a very complex world, to catch the voice of the Holy Spirit so that we can move forward confidently in the footsteps of the Good Shepherd, as we mentioned earlier, because we've listened to the Spirit and done our best to respond. So it's very exciting.
Can I link that as well with what you were just saying about the work of the plenary? We have also now the ACYF and your message as Archbishop to walk in the footsteps of the Good Shepherd.
Yes.
How would you like to tie all that together for the Perth Catholic community?
Yeah. In some way, I wouldn't want to oversimplify this, but in some ways I think it can all be summed up in one word, and that word is fidelity. I think the call to the Church right around the world, certainly here in Australia and certainly here in Western Australia, the call to the Church is to grow in fidelity to God's plan for the Church. People sometimes ask me how we will judge the success of the plenary council. Will it make major changes? Will there be big decisions taken? There may well be, but that won't be the way I judge the success of the council. If at the end of the council, and as whatever decisions are taken unfold in the life of the Church, if it becomes clear that we are more firmly on a path of fidelity to what the Lord is asking of us, I will feel that it's been a success, and I'll be very grateful and humbled by the opportunity to be a part of it.
Your Grace, thank you very much for your time today.
Good on you, Jamie. It's great to be with you. Thank you so much.
Greetings from Brisbane, Australia, which is very far from where most of you are. In Jesus Christ, what we hear, what we discover, is the good news. Here we find in Jesus Christ, crucified and risen, good news for everybody. And that's why Shalom Media really does have a contribution to make. Shalom Media is seeking to communicate to families and to show to the world the truth and the beauty of what the family is within the plan of God. May the blessing of God really come to you through all that is offered in Shalom World by Shalom Media. The word Shalom itself comes from Hebrew, as you know, and it means peace. May the blessing of God's peace, the Shalom of God, for which we were created, may it come to you from the God who is peace, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen.